Thank you all so much, and thank you for coming out later than expected. I was in Grand Rapids this morning, and at a 6 a.m. flight, which means we had to get there at 5. And after being on the plane for an hour, they said, "Oh, there's a mechanical problem. Everyone off." So, and that combined with the fact that I had food poisoning yesterday meant that probably no one would have wanted me here at noon anyway. I am going to talk briefly about how the book came about and some themes that I try and deal with in the book, and then leave as much time as I can for questions, because I've spoken with a number of different types of groups, and it's been very hard for me to anticipate what the questions are going to be outside of them always being provocative and interesting. So I expect that will be even more true tonight at a university where people are coming at it from all sorts of different angles, as opposed to a nursing coalition or a center for inquiry or different places I've talked. So, excuse me, I'll also be sipping a lot from replenishing my liquids. This book, this project started for me about 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago. And at the time, I was newly married. My wife and I had just moved into Brooklyn, into an area where there were a lot of young parents, a lot of parents-to-be, and I started hearing more and more discussion about this issue, about whether or not parents should vaccinate their children, about whether kids were getting too many too soon, about whether there was mercury in vaccines that could cause developmental disorders. And what struck me right away was that when I asked people how they would go about making up their minds, I kept hearing again and again that these were decisions that people were making essentially on gut instinct. They would say things like, well, it feels like a lot. This feels like a lot to give a kid. It doesn't feel safe. It seems like there are too many chemicals in there. And that struck me, not because I knew at the time that there was evidence on one side or the other necessarily, and as someone who has spent most of his career as a reporter and an investigative reporter, I was very willing to believe that drug companies and the government were engaged in a massive cover-up, and there were profit motives and incompetence had combined to create a real public health problem. That, to me, seemed like a potentially great story, frankly. But I was surprised that so many people that I knew were not making these decisions based on an analysis of the evidence. And it especially struck me because it was the same group of people, my peers essentially, that were very, very dismissive and disdaining of controversies about other issues like climate change or evolution, where they felt like people who they disagreed with were ignoring the scientific evidence. So there seemed to be this great disconnect to me. One of the reasons, I should say, at the time that it was probably starting to come up a lot is because Jenny McCarthy had just come out, I think, with the second of now her 4 books, focusing on her belief that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine had either caused or triggered her son's autism. And she said, I always try and be very careful with how I say this, but her story has not remained completely consistent, I guess, over the years. So I started looking into it, and I spent most of the last 3 years reading scientific studies, interviewing people, interviewing parents, parents whose children had died of vaccine-preventable diseases, parents whose children were very severely affected by autism, scientists, doctors, public health officials, activists, and I also read what ended up to be thousands and thousands of pages of court transcripts for an ongoing series of trials surrounding this issue. And at the end, it seemed really very clear to me that this wasn't a case where there was a legitimate debate that I felt about where the evidence actually lay. This was a situation in which there was an overwhelming amount of evidence on one side and a tiny number of discredited studies on the other side. So at that point, I really felt like there were two things that I had to address. One of them is, why is there this sense in our society and culture that this is such a debate? And there continues to be. There was a Harris poll taken 2 weeks ago in which only 52% of people said that they believed that vaccines did not cause autism. That doesn't mean the other 48% did. There were 30-something% that said they were unsure. But more than a decade after this whole specific vaccine scare has started, there's still an enormous number of the population that thinks that there's some legitimacy to that. So the things I wanted to explore were, one, why is that? Both from a media angle and an information consumer angle, and also from a sort of personal, from an individual angle. Why is it that we as individuals create narratives that we use to convince ourselves that things that appear not to be true actually are? Little did I know at the time that exactly how much that was to bite off. This was a project that initially started as a hopeful magazine story, and I couldn't interest any magazine editors in writing it. It's actually less rare that you would think. You can't sell a magazine article, but you can get someone to say that you can write a book. That always struck me as like, we don't want to read 5,000 words, but 130,000 words, great. But I ended up writing, this is a little bit less than half of the book that I ended up writing. Which is good. It definitely should not have been the length it was. But I'm just saying that as an illustration of the ways in which I felt like this one issue permeated through other things that we're dealing with as a society and as a culture. It's also the reason why neither the word autism nor vaccines appears in the title, which I had some spirited debates with my publisher, who kept saying, I believe that books should say what they're about. And I kept saying, well, it's not just about that, and we don't want to give people the impression that it's about this one specific topic. What I'm going to do is use some events that have occurred recently in the past month that some people might be familiar with, to show some of what I'm talking about, and that before I open it up. Now, I guess about 4 weeks ago, there was a series of reports in the British Medical Journal about a 1998 study that had appeared in The Lancet, which was the first study positing a link between vaccines and autism. That was the first time there had been a connection, a potential connection. Before that, for decades and for centuries, there have been different concerns and fears about vaccines and their links to other physical or developmental disorders, but this was the first time that there was a specific link drawn to autism. That paper in The Lancet involved the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine. And the lead author was a British gastroenterologist named Andrew Wakefield. Excuse me. He was one of 13 authors on the study. And what the British Medical Journal report that, or three-part series that started coming out about a month ago, said was that Wakefield had committed outright fraud when he submitted this report. The stories that then resulted on TV and in the newspapers was initial report that linked autism and vaccines debunked, which is both completely inaccurate and I think completely irresponsible. This was a study that had been debunked years earlier. Andrew Wakefield had lost his medical license as a result of the tests that he performed on children in this study that did not hold up. We've known for years that he had taken out a patent for an alternate measles vaccine just before he published this initial study in The Lancet. We also know that the 12 children who appeared in that study had not been consecutively referred as was initially claimed. And we know that there have not been any studies that have been able to replicate his findings. And in fact, there have been studies involving millions and millions of children that have shown the exact opposite, that there is not a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. So when the media went forward and framed this as study is debunked, and then as we, meaning the media, want to do, would have segments where you would have Andrew Wakefield on the one hand, and then someone from the CDC or the AAP or the AMA on the other hand, that gave and gives the impression that this is a on the one hand, on the other hand debate, which it is not. And I think that's a fundamental problem with the way the press acts specifically around medicine and health. It also oftentimes is an issue with politics. And I'm not saying that obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I'm not saying that reporters should come out in favor of one candidate or another. I'm saying that when someone says Barack Obama was not born in the United States, you do not then run a story that says X person claims that he was not born in the United States, and Barack Obama says, yes, in fact, I was. That's not a legitimate story to run. It's legitimate to say, I don't know whether candidate X or candidate Y's positions are going to be better for the country. I don't know if this or that economic policy is the right policy. But to take statements of fact, and because it's either controversial or you have someone controversial saying it, and to present that then as an on the one hand, on the other hand, is incredibly irresponsible on the part of the media, and I think does a disservice to us all as information consumers. So you had this happening here in the last month, and this time around, it is definitely true that reporters were much harder on Andrew Wakefield than they had been, for instance, a year earlier when The Lancet officially retracted its story and he lost his medical license. I think as all of the revelations about his initial work have come out, the media has consistently done less of the on the one hand, on the other hand. However, similar to the coverage of the birther movement, I still don't think that that is a responsible way to cover a story like that. There have been many studies. There was one in the University of Michigan in 2008 that gave test subjects 20 statements, 10 of which they said were true and 10 of which they said were false. 10 minutes later, there was a very high degree of the very high degree of accuracy, I guess. That's not exactly the word I'm looking for, but in the test subjects' ability to correctly remember what had been presented to them as true and what had been presented as false. That went very clearly down over time. So even in taking this as a story now, 13 years after the study came out, and saying that well, we're going to give all of this attention just so we can say, well, now this has been debunked, I also think is not really legitimate. It's a little bit like the political tactic of saying, well, I have no reason to suspect that my candidate beats his wife or that my opponent beats his wife. You introduce that concept into a population, and then, you know, when you see that candidate, you start to think like, well, you know, yeah, I have no reason either, but I wonder if that's true. It's very, very hard to unscare people. I think we can look at any number of things. For any parents out there, have any of you ever let your child have an apple that they got on Halloween? Has anyone ever gotten an apple on Halloween? Probably not, but there is no documented case of a kid getting a razor blade and an apple. You know, if we all gave out apples and all let our children eat apples on Halloween, the net effect on public health would probably be incredibly positive, as opposed to having them all eat candy. And it's highly unlikely that anyone actually would have gotten a razor blade. It's an urban myth that has somehow cropped up. But even knowing that, and even after all my research on this, if my son came home with an apple, first of all, I would say, how is it that a 14-month-old is out trick-or-treating on his own? But I'm sure I wouldn't let him eat it, because in the back of my mind there would be this sort of gnawing doubt that was there. I think that there are a couple of ways. There are a couple of well, let me back up one more second and talk about one more way in which I think the situation in which we find ourselves now could have been avoided, and it gets to what I think is another one of the big themes of my book, which is scientific literacy, both on the part of the population and the assumed ability of the population to understand science on the part of the public health apparatus, the medical community, and the journalistic community. I think that there's an assumption that the public in general is much stupider than we actually are. One thing I hear a lot is, excuse me, it's very hard, you can't explain to someone that it's impossible to prove a universal negative proposition, and which is a fundamental sort of tenet of the scientific method, and it's why you can never go on TV and say, I know that vaccines 100% do not cause autism and never will be shown to have any connection to autism. It's the same reason I can't go on TV and say, I know with 100% certainty that human beings will never be able to fly. All you can do is say no human being has flown. Because of that, we're fairly confident that as we go forward, no human being will be able to fly. And so we do not recommend that people jump off their houses with hopes that they then will be able to act like Superman. But for some reason, there's this sense around that and around other scientific concepts that it's something that's impossible to convey to the public. Another problem in the communication effort is that journalists, as a group, we are not, we for some reason do not treat science and health with the same degree of seriousness that we would expect of subjects like business or even sports or ballet or, you know, if I was, and when I was working in newspapers, no one would come to me and say, oh, there's this performance of the ballet tonight. Will you go and write about it? Because I know nothing about ballet. I'm completely incompetent to deal with that. All the time, I would get press releases about a health initiative, a medical initiative. This was in South Florida, so a lot about aging that I also had no knowledge or experience with, and would be told, okay, well, will you go write this up? I wouldn't be given an assignment to go cover a hockey game or a football game because I don't know enough about it to speak competently on it. But for some reason, we don't hold our coverage of science to that same level. We don't expect that same level of expertise or even minimal competency when we're dealing with science. And I think this is a situation in which that minimal level of competency could have altered the entire shape of this discourse. And I'll explain what I mean. The initial study that Andrew Wakefield did in 1998 was based on 12 children, a 12-person case study. And he said that these 12 children, their parents had given him, after the fact, recollections of changes in their children's behavior and the temporal correlation with when they got the MMR vaccine. I don't know how many people are here roughly today, or how many people are here in that third, let's say 25, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of you are men. There's a case study of the percent of the population that's male and female. That's the equivalent of being consecutively referred. They're randomly, I didn't pick out special groups. I said that third. If I then went and said, okay, well, 70% of the population is female, based on this case study I did, that would clearly be ridiculous. The most I could say from a case study is, well, that's interesting. There's this very isolated situation that I'm dealing with. And because the results seem to be statistically significant, that's something that maybe we should look at more and try and look at over a population or with a wider subset of people. I also, if you have a case series or a case study that is based on after-the-fact recollection, that's another reason, that's another reason why you would say, okay, well, this, again, might be an interesting starting point, but we know so much now about the unreliability of memory, of eyewitness testimony. It's a huge issue in courts. It's a huge legal issue. There's so much evidence about how easy it is for us to reformulate things in our mind to create a coherent narrative that it would be irresponsible of me to take people's recollections of a very emotional event and use that as the basis for a conclusion. So neither of those concepts require an incredible amount of expertise or advanced scientific training or advanced scientific knowledge. So what I think would have been a responsible way to cover the initial study, and even more than that, and this is probably more detailed than you want at this point, but the initial press conference where Andrew Wakefield came and said, I don't think parents should give their kids the MMR vaccine. I'm worried and I think we should space it out. I think a legitimate way to cover that would have been to say, what in the hell is this guy doing saying that based on absolutely nothing, based on a 12-person case series? What is a hospital doing holding this press conference? You want a controversial story, that's a controversial story, and one that accurately represents what the situation was. Instead, what you got the next day was all throughout London, all of the papers had stories that said, prominent researcher says that the MMR vaccine might cause autism. And then it had the standard on the one hand, on the other hand thing. What you saw very quickly, unfortunately there, was what happens when you inject a fear into a population. The measles vaccine uptake rate in the UK fell from above 90% to under 80%, and people started dying of measles. The fact that that's happening in the 21st century is astounding, I think. The effect in the US has been a little bit more diffuse because the UK, for a number of different reasons relating back to the 19th century, doesn't have mandatory school-age vaccination laws. So it's much easier for something like this to see an immediate drop. What you've seen here is over the past 10 years, and I don't know now exactly the number of states, but it's somewhere between 70 and 90% of states have now passed what is called a philosophical exemption law relating to vaccination, which means that in order to have your child go to a public school and not be vaccinated, you used to need a religious exemption. So a Christian scientist could obviously get a religious exemption. I could not go in as a Reformed Jew and say, oh, it's against my religion to get vaccinated. But now, with a philosophical exemption, all you need to do is go in and say, I don't believe in vaccines. And then you can go to school. Your children can go to school without being vaccinated. And so there are now pockets around the country where there are communities with incredibly low vaccination rates, 60, 70%, which is much, much lower than is needed to keep a given infectious disease out of that area. And so one thing that I hear a lot when I talk about this is, well, isn't it true that the overall vaccination rate in the country is still around 90%, or which is very high, and for many diseases is a high enough level to essentially keep it from spreading across the country as a whole? Well, yes, that's true. But that's a little bit like saying to someone without a job, well, the overall employment rate is 90%. In the country, so that should be fine. In those communities in which it's 60 or 70 or 80%, it's incredibly easy for a disease to get a toehold, and we've seen that. There was a measles epidemic in California that happened recently that started when a patient of Bob Sears, who wrote the vaccine book, not a fan, one of his patients, intentionally unvaccinated, caught measles in Switzerland, came back, lived in an area with a lot of other intentionally unvaccinated children. That ended up costing $10 million to contain. An infant was hospitalized for weeks. There were dozens of children who had to be quarantined at an average cost of between $700 and $1,000 per family. And this was all literally within a matter of days. I mean, measles is the most infectious microbe, one of the most infectious microbes known to man. To give a sense, this kid was in a Trader Joe's, and they had to quarantine everyone who had potentially come in contact with that Trader Joe's. Which gets to another, I asked a California Department of Public Health official, how do you know, if you're trying to find what communities are at risk, how do you figure this out? And he said, well, take a map, put a pin wherever there's a Whole Foods, and draw a circle around it. I'm waiting for the day when I get when I'm delivered a lawsuit from Whole Foods for defaming the, so I also throw in Prius owners in there. And we shop at Whole Foods, and my mom has a Prius. I mean, I'm not knocking. So those are the communities where it tends to be. It tends to be in communities where there's more of an emphasis on natural or organic living, much more affluent communities. If you talk to anyone who works in public health in the third world, there's a moral outrage, deservedly so, that they're struggling to get vaccine, to get someone to spend the 20 or 40 cents to get vaccines to areas where diarrhea is still the leading cause of childhood death. And here, Bob Sears is telling people to quote, hide in the herd if you don't want to vaccinate your children. There's a lot I didn't talk about. There's one more thing I just want to address before I open it up. And again, this is a little bit circuitous, and I'll partially blame that on the infectious microbe living in my stomach at the time. But relating back, I've had a lot of conversations with my peers and with other parents or parents-to-be or young parents or who've said, well, I don't feel, I'm just not going to do that. I'm just not going to vaccinate my kid. And I'm willing and do have conversations with them and explain my view. What gets me really upset is when those people aren't honest with themselves and the people around them about the repercussions of their actions. When I hear things like, well, it's my personal choice what I do, it's my choice what happens to my kid. If you want to go live on an island, then it's your choice. But if you are going to live in a society where you come in contact with pregnant women and with infants and with immune-challenged people who can't get vaccinated, it is not morally honest, I think, to say to yourself, this is a private decision I'm making. It's akin to saying it's a private decision to get drunk and get behind the wheel of my car. You're putting everyone you come in contact with at risk. I have talked to parents whose children were too young to have been vaccinated and died of whooping cough. In this country, 10 kids last year in California died of whooping cough. 9 of them were under 6 months old. That is not only heartbreaking and tragic, but I think reflects poorly on us as a society that is still happening. And I don't make suggestions about legal remedies or whether this should or shouldn't be something that is that there's a law for or against. I don't feel like that's my place, but it makes me crazy when parents make this decision and aren't honest with themselves or the people around them with how that decision ripples out and affects everyone else. And it makes me all the more crazy now that I have a son. There was someone at our pediatrician's office who, again, I don't know why Switzerland I feel like the Switzerland Tourist Board is also going to file suit against me, but someone who also had been on vacation in Switzerland, had measles, and just came into our pediatrician's office, walked into our pediatrician's office and said, well, I'm worried my son has measles. Can you check him out? Which meant that the entire office had to be shut down. And every kid who was there then had to be either, it had to be either quarantined or tested or, it's not like, oh, I think that maybe my kid has strep throat or something. I'll go and just bring him over here. No, this is something that is potentially lethal, that has killed more children than any other disease in the history of the world. That can blind you, can lead to lifelong complications. If I had known who that person is, I would have said very mean things to them. Yeah, there are about 6 more topics that I wanted to hit on, but again, because the areas in which people are interested in oftentimes don't coincide with what I feel like people might be interested in, I'm going to open it up. And I mean, one last thing that I didn't touch on at all is. As little sympathy as I have for parents who just decide, this is something I'm going to do, I feel almost as the opposite about parents who are dealing with, who have children who have very serious developmental disorders and believe that it's the result of vaccines. As much as I feel like it's a tragedy that children are dying, I think that the safeguards and support there are for families dealing with serious developmental disorders is also really disgraceful. I spent a lot of time at conferences, a lot of time with parents, and I am very much convinced that one of the reasons that the anti-vaccine movement has gotten such a toehold in these communities is because it's a community that gives them all support. It's where people can understand what they're going through and say, oh yeah, I can help you do this. I can be there for you. I can give you advice about what might happen next. You have a child that you can't bring out in public, or that soils himself, or that's violent. Here's what has happened to me, and here's what you might want to try. This is thankfully changing, but I talk to a lot of parents, and I know people even before this who this happened to, that basically, they got the diagnosis, and it was like, okay, here's your pamphlet, so you have a child with autism, all right, good luck. I don't deal with developmental disorders, so that's nothing I can deal with, and that's it. So, I feel like it's unfortunate that because of the way this debate has evolved, it's very difficult to talk about, to be a supporter of vaccines and not have that end up being framed as being somehow an enemy of parents who are dealing with this. And I think that's another one of the, something that's really awful about this, and that you have groups of parents who all want the same thing, which is to protect children, that are absolutely set at each other's proverbial throats. So I'll open it up for as long as you guys want to ask questions, and then hopefully you'll all buy 10 books, and yeah, so have at it. All right, well, good to, oh, yes.
One of my jobs in public health is to promote prevention activities like vaccination. Right. And I was very intrigued by your early mention of conspiracies among pharmaceutical companies. One of the challenges about communicating about science is that science is deliciously gray.
Right.
And the narrative around gray is a very hard narrative to sell to people. And it particularly becomes troubling when you literally are unable to say, well, this is 100% safe, this is 100% effective, nothing is 100% safe.
Sure, yeah.
100% effective, and there are people who get the flu vaccine who get the flu.
Right. No, there are definitely side effects to vaccines, definitely, yeah.
So one of the problems to me was particularly thrown into light this week in Newsweek. Sharon Bagley had a 2-page article about the quality of medical research.
Right.
And it was quite critical. And the part of it that I paid a lot of attention to is what the pharmaceutical companies seem to be doing to sort of suppress bad review research. And I just wonder how to fold what may in fact be a conspiracy theory with
the reality. Yeah.
You know, how to deal with that.
Well, I mean, it's certainly, I think, fortunately, this is not a scenario in which we need to take the drug company's word that vaccines are safe. If that was who we were relying on, I would have a problem with it too. I think the way that medical testing and medical research is done is hugely problematic. The peer review process, is problematic. The ways in which drug companies have relationships with review articles that aren't disclosed. I mean, there are a huge number of things that are problematic, and there have been case after case after case over the last decade where something has been brought to market, and we have then later found that it was either brought to market before it could be fully researched, or in fact when there was indications that there were some serious side effects. In this situation, I think that you don't need to worry about telling people you should take the MMR vaccine and be confident that it's safe because of Merck. You can say you can be confident that it's safe because of studies done by governments around the world, by researchers around the world on tens of millions of children. So I think one of the effects of now 13 years of this current sort of cycle of scares is that vaccines, and the vaccines that are currently on the schedule, are probably the single most studied public health initiative, childhood public health initiative that's in use today. So I think I think from my perspective, when people say to me, well, A, B, and C are all things that drug companies did, I don't argue that at all, and it's usually true. And I'm thankful that here we don't need to rely on the drug companies. I do think, getting to your sort of point about how do you deal with gray, I think that is also a real a problem, and not just around medicine, but in science generally. And an example that really helped clarify my thinking around this was climate change. This number is one I'm pulling out of not thin air, but it's not exactly what the number is. But so there's like 89 or 93 or whatever % of research that has strong indications that human beings have a very large role in the climate change that's going on. And then there's 11 or 7 or whatever % of studies that either have results that contraindicate that or are much more ambiguous. So there has been in the climate community for a long time this incredible anxiety that if there was an acknowledgement that it was 93% of the evidence as opposed to 100%, that would, global warming denier, there would never be any way to move forward with initiatives, environmental initiatives. So instead, we had discussion that this was 100%. And then when we all found out that in fact it wasn't, the rebound was much, much greater than I think the initial. It's sort of like the cover-up is greater than the crime. If as a scientific community there was more honesty from the outset, I think more people would feel comfortable saying, okay, 93%, that's a figure, that's a figure I can feel pretty confident with, then, oh, well, wait, why were they lying to me about this? And then is it going to go from 93% to 84% to 72%? Why should I now start to believe them when they tell me that this is true? So, and that's also something that's happened with vaccines. There's been a fear about accurately communicating the risks to the public, and people have negative reactions to vaccines. There's no question about that. People have negative reactions to seatbelts. A certain number of people every year die because their sternum is crushed because of a seatbelt. I will always wear a seatbelt because however many times out of 100, 99 point whatever, a seatbelt is going to protect me. But nothing works 100% of the time. Yes.
So Seth, I think the book is really well done.
Thank you.
Have you considered a career as an epidemiologist? Because what I'm impressed by is how you blended the science, your understanding of scientific process, but also journalism.
Right.
One question, somewhere in the book, I can't remember where, you brought up the issue of having science process in the public.
Right.
So that as people are debating whether trans fats are good or bad, study comes out this way, that way, and eventually we settle the issue.
Right.
But we do that in the public. And I think someone in the book, or you commented that, why don't scientists just do this behind closed doors? And then when they come up with the answer,
Well, I mean, right. I mean, you know, one easy answer to that is because you never come up with the answer. I mean, Newton was right until he wasn't, until Einstein showed that he wasn't right. You know, we come up with hopefully a series of increasingly better answers and more refined answers. But science is really about, and this is something I talk about in my book, science is really about being wrong, about, you know, you come up with a theory and then you sort of say, all right, everyone have at it. And all you can do, because of the inability to prove a universal negative proposition, all you can do is show that there have been X number of very comprehensive efforts to show that it's wrong, and they've all failed, and so it seems to indicate that it's right. You know, again, I think the public is more capable of understanding some nuance and risk than they often, or we often, get credit for or give credit for. You know, I was watching CNN before I came over here, and it makes me doubt that sometimes. But you know, I think in general we take risks every day. You know, we do things that make no sense on a logical level, and we do them because we understand that there's scientific evidence supporting them, like flying, you know, like chemotherapy. There are all sorts of things that we accept as parts of our everyday life because, on some level, we obviously have faith in science. And I think that so I think that there actually is more respect and understanding for science and the scientific process out there. But it's very easy to harm that, to hurt that. And when there's a sense of there being a cover-up or of something going on behind the scenes, I think it's much, much harder to get that trust back than it is along the way to sort of say, okay, well, this is what's going on.
But in a way, it's even worse, isn't it? Because the truth is that a lot of science is not very good quality.
Well, that's a whole other issue. Yeah.
That's actually where it starts. A lot of what is claimed to be evidence-based, and that is actually not
Right. That's true. I mean, it's
we're not very good at keeping our own house in order.
right.
As science.
Not me. I'm not a scientist. Come on, we have no problem in journalism. Wow, that got a hearty. Yes, I mean, I agree. And again, I mean, it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to, I mean, when you find out that there are doctors who have been putting their name on journal articles that never read the article and had nothing to do with it, or, yeah, it hurt, you know, it definitely, that becomes negative for the entire field. You know, and maybe it's because I'm not a scientist, but I think that the same way that I think overall people go into politics because they believe in public service, and people go into law enforcement because they want to protect the people around them. I think that the vast majority of scientists are in the field because they're interested in intellectual exploration, and I think that they're well, I always say to myself, don't make pronouncements, and then I always fail. So how can I phrase this? In my experience and from my research, I think that scientists and the scientific community would benefit by holding itself to higher standards. I mean, I think when someone is revealed to have had their name on an article that they had nothing to do with, that should be so humiliating that then they have a hard time going to the next faculty meeting, or And that's not what you get a lot of times. You know, and I think that is something that could be very beneficial. And you know, and what I was talking about with journalism earlier, it very much applies to my field. I mean, I think people should be embarrassed to have written the stories that they wrote about the Wakefield studies in 1998. And they're not. Instead, now they're just writing the next story about that. And I think we should hold you know, our colleagues to those type of standards. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the birther movement,
Mm-hmm.
kind of the way that was covered as being an example of how, I guess, journalism gave credence to the whole notion of Obama not being an American citizen.
Right.
But in a sense, aren't journalists just trying to tell that story? Because isn't that a story in itself that people think that the president isn't?
Yes. Yes. Could everyone hear that question? No. Okay. The question was in relation to the birther movement. Correct me if I'm phrasing this wrong, but how do you draw a distinction between covering a story that's a story because there are people who believe this versus covering a story as if it's a story because it's a legitimate question? And I think that's a very good point. The coverage of the birther movement, you know, I mean, I shouldn't say all, but I think the reason that took off so much was because it was not covered in a framework of why is it that some people believe this. It was covered in why won't he show us his birth certificate. You know, it was covered in, well, can we believe the Honolulu Star-Advertiser's birth announcement from the day after he was born, or does the conspiracy on the part of Nigeria and, you know, date back to when he was born? You know, you had Lou Dobbs day after day after day on CNN talking about this. Again, you know, I think CNN should be embarrassed and should have been embarrassed and should have said, you know, you can't, like, shut up. You can't say that on our airwaves. There was, I said that to someone, and someone said, well, that's you're impinging on his freedom of speech, which I love. Like, where's freedom of speech doesn't mean that you get a talk show on CNN. I mean, it's like, you know, Laura Schlesinger, after she was throwing around racial epithets, went about how her First Amendment was violated. It's like, she can say that in her own home as much as she wants. It's, you know, she doesn't have a right to a talk show about it. And, you know, the other thing I'd say is there are lots of crazy things that people believe that we don't cover as stories. You know, the Flat Earth Society is not, there's not going to be a story on CNN tomorrow night. There's not going to be a story about people who believe that the CIA is implanting radio chips in their brain. But yeah, I think there is a way to cover some stories that it does it in more of that light. And I think that if they're covered in that light, you wouldn't see them, you know, you wouldn't have seen the birther story sort of take off the way that it did. And I think, you know, in the Wakefield, I think that's what could have been done right off the bat with the Wakefield study. You could, you know, the story could have been, why is it that someone is saying this, and that and not that there's a 50% chance that this is true. Yes.
I apologize because I bought the book this morning and haven't read it.
What do you mean you apologize? Would that all of you were in the.
But as a historian, did you really find that the story starts in 1998, or is it traced back further to other episodes around vaccines or medical science, you know, including 1976?
Yes, that's yeah, right. So the question was, did I feel like this debate started in 1998 with the Wakefield paper, or did it go back further? And the reference was to a 1976 effort by Gerald Ford to do a mass swine flu immunization campaign. that was a debacle for a number of reasons. This specific fear about autism started here, but I think your point is absolutely correct that there have been cyclical scares about vaccines as long as there have been vaccines. Most of the time what's happened is when a disease is endemic in a society, everyone wants the vaccine. And then when a vaccine is effective, people then start to become more concerned about the vaccine's potential repercussions. It's sort of this vicious cycle or paradox of vaccines. The more effective they are, the less necessary they seem. And so, and then there have been, again, throughout history, incidents in which vaccine safety was poorly handled, or communication about vaccine efforts was very poorly handled. And because what I'm about to say is probably a situation people are more familiar with than the swine flu situation in 1976. An example that I bring up is the current situation we face with the hepatitis B vaccine, which is oftentimes given and oftentimes recommended at birth. Hepatitis B is primarily, not solely, but primarily a blood-borne disease. That, common modes of transmission would be IV drug use or unprotected sex, neither of which newborns are at high risk of engaging in. And the reason, or one of the reasons, and one of the strongest reasons for giving the hepatitis B vaccine at birth is that the populations that are most at risk of giving their children hepatitis B, either through breast milk or because they're already carriers, is also the population least likely to come in for follow-up pediatric care. So they want to give the vaccine as, there they are in the hospital. They want to, but you can't say in a public health setting, we recommend this if you're poor or disadvantaged or live in an area where there's high drug abuse, or, that doesn't fly. So I think people are therefore skeptical of the hepatitis B vaccine, and when people ask when people ask their doctors why their child is supposed to get the hepatitis B vaccine at birth, there's really not a very good answer. And a lot of doctors that I know that are incredibly passionate about vaccines say you don't need to give that at birth. But the net effect of that is, okay, well then, why do I need to do this? So why not that and why this? And that's I think that has been a consistent problem. That type of communication has been a consistent problem. With the hepatitis B situation, I have no idea how one might handle that. I see why that's difficult. It's hard to make a pronouncement about that. But I do think that's a situation in which there is less than total transparency and honesty with a patient population. And when you're dealing with a kid, and especially with a newborn, that sets off alarm bells. Yes?
I'm curious, what type of reaction has generated in the
The question was, what type of reaction has this generated in the anti-vaccine circuits? The type of reaction that has led me to take pictures of my family offline, and I don't have a listed phone number, or I get a lot of and the Lord saith, vengeance will be mine emails, or accusations of of having a child in order to sell a book and poison my child so that I can sell a book. You know, very angry emails. And again, you know, it can be very difficult when you feel like your family is being, you know, not threatened, but when people are talking about your family like that. But I have spent time with a lot of people who feel very passionately about vaccines and about what they believe the effects of their children have been. And I try to remember that they're coming from a place of fully and honestly believing that vaccines are essentially poison that is being injected into infants and is harming them. You know, so I try not to, I try to either not respond or respond in a way that will start a dialogue. And usually when I do that, I just don't hear back. I have to say, I've gotten more reaction than I would have expected from families dealing with autism who have been appreciative that there is a discussion and an awareness about that not everyone in the autism community feels this way. I think one thing that has been very difficult for autism advocates is the ways in which that has become associated with anti-vaccine sentiment. And there are people who are very, very concerned, and I think probably it's a somewhat legitimate concern that, you know, when you have children dying of whooping cough, when you have measles outbreaks, there is the potential for a backlash against against autism advocacy and autism research. Yeah, the reaction from anti-vaccine advocates, I guess, has been about what I've expected. But I mean, there are people who've written about this who need FBI protection. I'm clearly not in that situation. She's the FBI agent. Yes.
We've already heard from the audience that science is great, that scientists are really bad at their job.
Right. I don't know, is that, yeah, right.
I'm curious, just sort of follow on from that, what scientists, every scientist writes journal articles and they tend to be behind a paywall and they're difficult for the public to get hold of. And then journalists have not much as privileged in that we could all write a book, but you probably have more of a flair for the language.
Right.
I wonder how much the problem of the autism and vaccine scandal is a product of the bad and good journalists who are arguing this out, as opposed to being bad and good scientists.
Well, I think
what we as scientists can do to communicate better.
I think that definitely a big issue is the limited number of people who seem to be able to speak science and English in a way that, and are in a position to talk about that with the public. That I think was probably one of the most challenging parts of this. Was I felt like I couldn't write a book about how important it is to understand science and not be able to explain it in a way that my niece could understand. But I think it's interesting that you talked about journal articles being behind paywalls, because that's a huge pet peeve of mine. I mean, if you go online and you want to research this issue, you can get the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons, which sounds impressive. Is a journal that had a study about how Barack Obama was exerting mind controls, especially on Jews and intellectuals, and that was how he won the presidency. And he was doing this with this cadence, and his repetition of numbers was one of the ways he did this. But they're not behind a paywall, And so you can go on the Journal of American Physicians and American Physicians and Surgeons, and find articles about how vaccines cause autism. If you go on Science or Nature, you can read the abstract, and then it's can be anywhere from $18 to $30 for a single article. I think that's a big problem. It's a big problem for me as someone who is writing about science, that I need to make a sort of cost-benefit analysis or find someone whose university account I can surreptitiously use to access journals. I think that it would be, I think efforts like the Public Library of Science are hugely important. I think anything that we can do to make science more accessible is hugely important. I think one of the things is not making it so prohibitively expensive. Because in fact, I'm always surprised in science and nature and applied molecular biology, and a lot of those articles I think are actually fairly comprehensible by the general public, especially the ones that are not the individual case studies. I mean, the ones that have gotten to the point where you're dealing with big epidemiological reports. You're dealing with a big enough issue that you actually can understand a lot of what's being discussed there. I don't know if that was a satisfactory answer, but yeah, I think that we need more journalists who speak science. We need more scientists who speak English. I mean, I think that a lot of that is needed. Let me do one more. Should we? One more question, or not? No more questions. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Right. I mean, yeah, again, I think one of the reasons why this is a story that it has such a sticky narrative is because, if you were going to the movies and there was a story about parents fighting against bureaucracies and the government and drug companies versus a story about bureaucracy, the government, and drug companies actually not hurting parents who think that it is, I'm going to Aaron Brockovich. I'm not going to whatever the, whatever the other story would be. What fascinates me about this is, CDC officials, we're not talking about like people getting rich off the fat of the land. I mean, when you're dealing with that type of public health servant, I mean, it's amazing to me that this narrative has been defined in a way that demonizes really, like pediatricians and public health officials. I mean, doctors all are very well paid, definitely, but if you wanted to be a doctor to make a lot of money, you should be a plastic surgeon or something. You shouldn't be a pediatrician where you need to deal with, anxious parents and crying kids. And every time I see my pediatrician, I feel like she deserves combat pay. So, and it's amazing to me that those are the people that have somehow been demonized in this debate. So, and I think it's the sort of get your hands off my Medicaid, and it's what that represents is the way, to me, the way in which there has been an effective depersonalization, bureaucratization of different areas of public health, in which if there's any area that the public health apparatus should be able to show has a human face, it's pediatricians, it's CDC researchers, so yeah. Again, probably not a very satisfying answer, but so I guess if there are more, I'll stick around until I start vomiting on people. And we'll sign these, and we're happy to answer any other questions that people have. Just come up and ask away. My armed guard will be here.